It was a normal afternoon when Officer Roberts, a young, white police officer, pulled up behind a sleek black car driving down a quiet street. He flipped on his siren and waited for the car to pull over. The woman inside, Monique Carter, a well-dressed black woman in her early 40s, did exactly that, turning her indicator on and slowing to a stop. Monique had just finished a long day of work at the FBI, where she had been investigating a serious case involving corruption within the local police force. As she sat in her car, she couldn't help but feel the familiar tension that came with being pulled over, especially when she knew that, as a black woman, she was often unfairly judged. But she had been through this before and stayed calm, knowing she had done nothing wrong. The officer walked up to her window, a look of suspicion on his face. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Do you know why I pulled you over?" he asked. Monique kept her composure. "No, officer, I'm not sure," she replied politely, but she could see in his eyes that he was already sizing her up. Something felt off. "Can I see your driver's license and registration?" the officer asked, his tone colder now. Monique handed over her documents, but something about the officer's attitude seemed strange. His eyes wandered suspiciously over her car, and he looked at her as if he didn't believe she belonged in a luxury vehicle like hers. Monique's instincts were on high alert. She'd experienced these types of moments before, but she stayed calm, trying not to escalate things. The officer took the documents and walked back to his patrol car. Monique sat there, feeling the weight of the situation. Was he going to question her more? Was he going to find some excuse to search her car? As the officer walked back toward her, Monique's thoughts shifted to what was about to happen. He handed her the documents back, but something was wrong. Something felt off. As she reached to take them, she noticed something else. He had taken money from her purse in the car. Without her noticing at first, the officer had stolen from her while she wasn't looking. Monique's heart sank, but she didn't react immediately. She knew this wasn't just an ordinary traffic stop. It was a breach of trust and a grave mistake the officer had made. But she had a choice now. Should she confront him immediately, or let him dig himself deeper? She decided it was time for a truth he wasn't expecting. "Officer," Monique began, her voice calm but firm, "I think you might want to know something. I'm an FBI agent, and I just caught you in the act." The officer froze. His face went pale, his eyes wide with shock as he realized the terrible mistake he had just made. Stealing from an FBI agent, this wasn't something he could just ignore. Monique Carter grew up in a small town, where she quickly learned the importance of standing up for herself. As a child, she faced many challenges, but she was determined to rise above them. She was one of the few black students in her school, and she often found herself dealing with prejudice from classmates and teachers alike. But rather than letting these obstacles hold her back, Monique used them as fuel to push harder. Her parents were both hard-working people who believed in the power of education. They taught her that success didn't come easy, but that didn't mean it was impossible. Monique's mother was a nurse, and her father worked as a mechanic. They didn't have much money, but they worked tirelessly to give Monique the best life they could. She watched her parents sacrifice their time and energy to provide for her, and she knew that she wanted to do something that would make them proud. From a young age, Monique excelled in school. She loved reading and learning new things, and she made sure to take advantage of every opportunity that came her way. Her teachers were impressed by her dedication, and it wasn't long before she earned a scholarship to a prestigious university. She decided to study criminal justice, with the hope of one day working in law enforcement. Monique was drawn to the idea of helping others, and she was determined to use her skills and education to make the world a better place. While at university, Monique faced many challenges, especially as a black woman in a field where she was often one of the few people of color. But she didn't let this stop her. She joined clubs, got involved in activism, and used her voice to speak out against injustice wherever she saw it. She was passionate about fighting inequality and making sure that people, regardless of their race or background, were treated with respect. After graduation, Monique joined the FBI. It wasn't an easy journey. She had to prove herself every day, both to her colleagues and to herself. In the male-dominated world of law enforcement, Monique often had to work twice as hard to be taken seriously, but she did it. Through years of hard work, determination, and countless hours of training, Monique worked her way up in the FBI. She became known for her sharp mind, her ability to stay calm under pressure, and her dedication to her job. Monique was not just any agent. She had become one of the FBI's top investigators. Her work focused on fighting corruption within law enforcement. She had seen firsthand how some officers abused their power, and she was determined to bring justice to those who were using their badges to take advantage of others. Monique had worked on several high-profile cases that had exposed corruption within the police force, and she had earned the trust and respect of her colleagues. However, as successful as she was in her career, Monique still faced discrimination and prejudice, even in a place like the FBI. While the agency had made strides in diversity, Monique still had to prove herself over and over again, especially when working with other law enforcement officers who were often skeptical of her abilities because of her race and gender. Monique had learned to be patient, but she had also learned how to stand her ground. She knew that she had earned her place in the FBI and that no one could take that from her. She had fought hard to get where she was, and she wasn't going to let anyone, especially an officer with prejudice, tear that down. On the day she was pulled over, Monique had just finished investigating a high-profile case involving a local police department accused of corruption. She had been working on this case for months, gathering evidence and piecing together information that would bring those responsible to justice. It had been an exhausting day, but Monique was proud of the work she had done. She was on her way home when the officer pulled her over, and it seemed like just another routine stop. But she quickly realized this wasn't going to be a normal situation. As the officer began questioning her and treating her with suspicion, Monique knew that something was wrong. His behavior felt familiar, like so many of the encounters she had experienced throughout her life. She had seen the way people looked at her when she walked into a room. She had felt the weight of assumptions placed on her shoulders, and now she could feel that same judgment from this officer. He wasn't just questioning her. He was assuming she didn't belong in the car she was driving. He thought she was just another woman who didn't deserve to be behind the wheel of a luxury car. Monique had stayed calm, refusing to let him see how much his actions bothered her. She knew she couldn't let this moment get to her. She had worked too hard, faced too many challenges, and made too many sacrifices to let one officer's prejudice define who she was. But when she noticed him stealing from her car, she realized that this wasn't just about prejudice. It was about an officer abusing his power. She took a deep breath, letting the shock of the situation sink in. The officer didn't realize it yet, but he had made a huge mistake. Monique wasn't just a woman he could dismiss. She was an FBI agent, someone who had spent her life fighting for justice. And now, it was time for him to face the consequences of his actions. It was a quiet afternoon when Officer Roberts, a young white police officer, pulled up behind Monique's sleek black car. She was driving home after a long day at work. She had been investigating a case involving corruption in a local police department. The weight of the case hung heavy on her mind, but Monique had learned to push through tough days like this. She was used to the long hours, the stress, and the challenges of her job with the FBI, but today was different. As Monique slowed down and pulled to the side of the road, she immediately felt something wasn't right. The officer's car had flashed its lights too quickly for it to be a routine traffic stop. She'd been pulled over before, but the tension in the air today was more palpable. Officer Roberts stepped out of his car, walking toward Monique's vehicle with an air of suspicion. Monique rolled down her window and looked at him. He was young, maybe in his late 20s, with a serious expression on his face. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Do you know why I pulled you over?" the officer asked in a formal tone. Monique stayed calm, already used to this kind of questioning. "No, officer, I'm not sure," she replied, her voice steady. The officer squinted as he looked at her. Monique immediately felt the judgment in his eyes, like he had already decided something about her. She was a black woman driving a luxury car, and she could feel the weight of his assumptions. She wasn't surprised. It happened often, but today, she wasn't in the mood for games. "I need to see your driver's license and registration," the officer said, still eyeing her suspiciously. Monique handed him the documents, keeping her composure. She knew the routine, but something about the officer's cold demeanor didn't sit well with her. He wasn't just doing his job. He seemed to be looking for a reason to question her further, to make her feel uncomfortable. The officer looked over the documents, then started walking back to his car without saying much. Monique sat back in her seat, trying to stay patient. But as she sat there, waiting, her mind raced. Something wasn't right. Why had he been so quick to pull her over? Was it the car? Was it her? She didn't know, but she had a feeling that this wasn't just a simple stop. A few minutes passed before Officer Roberts returned to her window. He handed her back the papers and began speaking in a more accusatory tone. "Ma'am, there's something strange about this car. I'm going to need to check it," he said. Monique's eyebrows furrowed. "Check my car? For what?" she asked, her voice calm but with a hint of confusion. The officer didn't answer her right away. He just nodded to himself and started walking around the car, peering inside. Monique didn't like the feeling this was giving her. It wasn't just about the car. It felt like he was going out of his way to make her feel like she didn't belong. He reached the driver's side door and opened it. Monique didn't stop him. She knew her rights, and she knew he didn't have a valid reason to search her car, but she remained silent, letting him make his move. He was clearly trying to provoke a reaction, trying to force her to say or do something that could justify his actions. And then it happened. As he moved around the car, his hand brushed across her purse, which was sitting on the passenger seat. In that moment, Monique noticed something. He had taken money from her purse. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her feel sick. He had stolen from her while pretending to check the car. Monique's blood ran cold. She didn't react immediately. Instead, she remained perfectly still. She knew what she had to do, and she wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of seeing her flustered. She kept her expression calm, but inside, her anger was building. This officer, who was supposed to uphold the law, had just violated it in front of her. Monique took a deep breath, trying to remain focused. She had to handle this carefully. She had seen how officers like him acted, dismissive, presumptuous, and often getting away with things because no one challenged them. But this time, it would be different. This officer had just made the biggest mistake of his life. As he returned to her window, ready to give his usual excuses, Monique spoke calmly but with authority, her voice cutting through the tension. "Officer, I think you might want to know something," she said. "I'm an FBI agent, and I just caught you stealing from me." The officer froze. His eyes widened in shock, as the words hit him like a ton of bricks. He quickly stepped back, clearly rattled by her revelation. He had no idea who he had just pulled over, but now the tables had turned. Monique wasn't just any ordinary person. She was an FBI agent, and the stakes were now higher than he could imagine. Monique could feel the tension in the air as the officer stood frozen, his face pale, clearly in shock. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The officer's hand, which had been rummaging around in her purse, slowly dropped to his side. Monique could see the sweat on his brow, and his body language screamed that he didn't know how to respond. "I didn't know," the officer finally stammered, looking around as if searching for an escape. "I didn't mean to—" Monique didn't let him finish. Her voice remained steady, but it carried authority. "You didn't mean to steal from me? You didn't mean to search my car without permission?" The officer swallowed hard, trying to regain some control of the situation, but his words faltered. He had made a huge mistake, and now there was no way out. Monique wasn't just any driver he could intimidate into silence. She was an FBI agent, someone who had dedicated her life to upholding the law, not someone to be taken advantage of. "You've broken the law," Monique continued, her tone firm. "You stole from me while pretending to search my car. You assumed I wouldn't notice. Well, you were wrong." The officer took a step back, clearly shaken. "I'm sorry. I thought you were just some woman with a fancy car. I didn't think—" Monique raised her hand, cutting him off. "You didn't think. That's the problem. You saw a black woman driving a luxury car and you decided to treat me differently. You assumed I didn't belong in this car. And you took advantage of that." The officer opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The weight of Monique's words hung heavy in the air. She could see the shame on his face, but there was no time for pity. This wasn't just a matter of a single officer's mistake. This was about something bigger: racial profiling, abuse of power, and misplaced authority. The officer's knees seemed to wobble slightly. "I didn't know you were an FBI agent," he muttered, still clearly disoriented by the revelation. "I didn't realize who you were." Monique stood her ground unwavering. "That's exactly the point. You didn't think to ask. You didn't think to treat me like a person with respect. You just assumed I was guilty of something because of how I looked." The officer was silent, his eyes now avoiding hers. Monique could feel the weight of the moment. It was clear he wasn't just apologizing because he had been caught. It was more than that. The realization that he had made such a deep mistake was beginning to sink in. The silence stretched on, and Monique waited. She wasn't about to let him off the hook just because he was feeling guilty now. He had made an active choice to steal from her and assume the worst. He needed to face the consequences, and Monique was going to make sure of that. "You don't get to violate my rights because you assumed I didn't belong here," she said calmly. "And you certainly don't get to take things from me just because you thought I wouldn't notice." The officer nodded, his face flushed with embarrassment, but Monique wasn't finished. She needed him to fully understand what he had done. "You'll have to face the consequences for your actions," Monique said. "Stealing from someone is a crime, and I will make sure that you are held accountable. But more than that, I want you to understand how dangerous your assumptions are. You're a law enforcement officer. You're supposed to protect people, not take advantage of them." The officer finally met her eyes, his face still pale but now filled with guilt. "What do you want me to do?" he asked quietly. "How can I fix this?" Monique looked at him with a steady gaze. "First, you need to understand that you can't just take things into your own hands. You need to respect people, all people, regardless of what they look like or how much money they have. Then, You need to make sure this doesn't happen again. Not just to me, but to anyone else." The officer nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "I understand. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." Monique took a deep breath, finally breaking the silence that had hung between them for so long. The officer wasn't just apologizing for stealing money from her. He was facing a larger truth about his own biases and assumptions. Monique didn't expect an overnight transformation, but she hoped this was the start of a process. He was now aware of the damage he had caused, not just to her, but to his own integrity as a law enforcement officer. But Monique wasn't about to let him off easily. She had to make sure this wouldn't be forgotten. She would report this to the officer's superiors, and this would be the beginning of holding him accountable for what he had done. The tension in the air was thick as Officer Roberts stood in front of Monique, still reeling from the shock of his mistake. He had just realized the gravity of what he had done, and the guilt was now starting to settle in. But Monique wasn't about to let him off the hook. This wasn't just about the stolen money. It was about the deeper issue, how he had treated her based on her appearance and assumed she didn't belong in that car. "You still don't get it, do you?" Monique said, her voice calm but firm. "It's not just about me. It's about how you treated me because of who you thought I was. You assumed that because I was a black woman in a luxury car, I didn't deserve respect. You assumed I was guilty of something without any proof, just based on my appearance." The officer's face flushed, his hands trembling slightly. He opened his mouth to speak but couldn't find the words. Monique didn't wait for him to respond. Instead, she continued, her voice growing even firmer. "You've been trained to serve and protect. But what you did today was the opposite of that. You didn't serve me. You didn't protect me. You treated me like I was a criminal because of your own biases. And that's not just wrong. It's dangerous." Monique took a slow breath, letting the weight of her words sink in. The officer was now visibly shaken, clearly understanding the magnitude of his actions. She could tell that this wasn't just about the stolen money anymore. This was about confronting the system and the prejudices that had led to this moment. "I know you didn't mean to do it," Monique said, her tone softening slightly. "But intent doesn't change what happened. You let your assumptions control your actions. And now, you're going to face the consequences for that." The officer nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to judge you. I made a huge mistake." Monique studied his face. She didn't want to hear more empty apologies. Words were easy, but actions were what mattered. She had been in law enforcement long enough to know that people often apologized when they were caught, but real change only came when people took responsibility for their actions and learned from them. "I'm glad you're sorry," she said, "but saying sorry isn't enough. You need to do more than apologize. You need to change the way you see people, all people, no matter their background, their race, or the car they drive. It's not about money or appearances. It's about respecting others." For a moment, there was silence between them. The officer seemed to be processing what Monique had said, but she wasn't done yet. She had to make sure this wasn't a lesson he would forget. Monique took out her phone and called her superior, telling them what had happened. She didn't feel any anger, only a sense of responsibility. She had seen what unchecked power could do, and she wasn't about to let this officer's actions slide without consequences. "Thank you for your patience, Officer Roberts," she said as she ended the call. "I'm reporting this, and you will be held accountable. This is not just about you and me anymore. This is about showing the public that law enforcement officers are not above the law. You took something from me, but more importantly, you tried to take away my dignity, and that's something I won't allow." The officer stood there silently nodding. Monique could see the shame in his eyes, and it was clear that he was fully aware of the gravity of his actions. The apology he had given earlier was genuine, but Monique needed to make sure it wasn't just words. It needed to be part of a bigger change. The officer's radio crackled to life, and Monique listened carefully. He would likely face disciplinary action, and Monique's report would make sure of it. She had made it clear to him that he would be accountable, not just to her, but to the entire law enforcement system. "I'll do better," the officer said, his voice shaky but sincere. "I'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Monique nodded. "I hope you do. I hope this is the moment you start questioning your actions before you make decisions. I hope this is the moment you truly understand the harm that prejudice can do, not just to me, but to everyone around you." The officer nodded again, his expression one of remorse. Monique knew this would be a turning point for him. Maybe it wasn't enough to undo the harm, but at least he was now aware of the consequences of his actions. With one last glance at the officer, Monique got into her car. She didn't look back as she drove off, but she knew she had done something important today, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever faced prejudice. This moment was bigger than her. It was a reminder that no one should be treated unfairly because of who they are, how they look, or the assumptions others make. As Monique drove away, she felt a sense of calm. It wasn't about victory. It was about making sure that the injustice she faced that day didn't go unnoticed. And maybe, just maybe, this officer would never again make the same mistake. As Monique drove away from the scene, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. The officer was going to be held accountable for his actions, and she had made sure that he would face the consequences. But the feeling of relief was mixed with something else, a quiet determination. Monique knew that the situation wasn't over. It wasn't just about this one officer, but about making sure that others didn't follow the same path. Monique had worked in law enforcement for years, and she had seen how easy it was for officers to hide behind their badges and power. She knew how dangerous unchecked authority could be. Today, she had taken a stand, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been wrongly judged or mistreated by someone in a position of power. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from her superior at the FBI. "We're aware of the situation. Thanks for handling it. We'll follow up on your report, and the department will make sure this is addressed appropriately." Monique nodded as she read the message. She wasn't looking for praise. She just wanted to know that the officer would be held responsible. She wanted to make sure that he understood that his actions weren't just about taking money from her. They were about the way he had treated her based on his assumptions. She wanted him to realize that no one should ever have to go through that again. The next few days passed quietly, but Monique couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The officer had apologized, but she knew the real work came in the form of change, not just for him, but for the entire system. The more she thought about it, the more Monique realized that the situation was about more than racial profiling or abuse of power. It was about making sure that every person, regardless of who they were, was treated with fairness and respect. Her report had already sparked a conversation within the department. Monique had seen some early signs of change. The officer was placed on leave while his actions were reviewed, and the department had promised to address the incident seriously. But Monique knew that the real change would come when policies and procedures began to reflect the values of fairness, integrity, and equality that she stood for. A few weeks later, Monique received another call. This time it was from the local police department. Her report had made a huge impact, and the department had decided to launch a new training program aimed at addressing biases within law enforcement. They had reached out to Monique, asking if she would be willing to assist with the training sessions, helping officers understand the importance of fair treatment and the dangers of stereotyping. "I'd be happy to help," Monique replied, a small smile creeping onto her face. This was what she had been hoping for: real change, not just within the department but in the community as well. She knew that if they were serious about making a difference, this was the first step toward building trust between law enforcement and the people they served. As Monique stood in front of a group of officers during the first training session, she could see the seriousness in their eyes. She spoke to them about her experience, not as an FBI agent, but as a person who had been judged unfairly simply because of how she looked. She shared her story, her journey in law enforcement, and the challenges she had faced. The officers listened intently, some nodding in understanding, others visibly uncomfortable with what they had heard. "This is about recognizing that we all have biases," Monique explained during the session. "We may not always be aware of them, but they shape how we see and treat others. As officers, it is our job to ensure that we treat everyone with fairness, dignity, and respect, no matter their background or appearance." She could feel the room shift as the officers absorbed her words. This wasn't just a lesson, it was a call to action. Monique wasn't just there to lecture them, she was there to remind them of the responsibility they had. Law enforcement was not about wielding power. It was about protecting the people, making sure that every individual was treated with honor and respect. The training continued over the next few weeks, and Monique's involvement became a key part of the department's efforts to change. The conversations were tough and sometimes uncomfortable, but they were necessary. Monique had spent years working toward justice, and now she was helping others understand how to achieve it. She wasn't just teaching them about their responsibilities as officers, she was showing them how to be better people. In the end, Monique's encounter with the officer had turned into something much bigger. It had started with a simple traffic stop and a stolen dollar, but it had sparked a conversation about accountability, fairness, and equality. Monique had stood up for herself that day, but more importantly, she had stood up for what was right. She had helped others see that prejudice and discrimination had no place in a system that was supposed to protect and serve everyone. Monique's work wasn't over, but as she looked back on the progress that had been made, she felt a sense of pride. She had taken something negative and turned it into an opportunity for change. She had faced an officer's abuse of power and used it to make the world a better, more just place for everyone. Monique's story is a powerful reminder that change starts with each of us. It's easy to let biases and assumptions cloud our judgment, but it's up to us to challenge them. We must treat everyone with respect, no matter their background, race, or appearance. When we stand up against injustice, we make a difference, not just for ourselves, but for everyone around us. Have you ever faced a situation where you were judged unfairly? Or have you witnessed someone else being treated differently because of how they look? Share your experience in the comments below. Let's start a conversation about how we can make our communities more inclusive and just for all. If you believe that stories like Monique's matter, share and subscribe to this channel. Together we can continue to challenge stereotypes and push for the change we all need. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. Let's keep fighting for equality, fairness, and justice together.